Don't you hate it when that happens to you? When it does, you need this and this and this. When it happens to me, I always know where to go. When you've got professionals on your side, your problems don't stand a chance. What are you waiting for? Contact them today and let them take care of your problems.
Hello, I'm Herdy with Extreme Wizards Digitizing. This will be the first of hopefully many video tutorials to come. In this first tutorial, we're going to try our hand at digitizing a candy cane. I'm going to be using two different types of softwares for all my videos. For this one, I'll be using Wilcom, but in the future, I will also be using Melco's Design Shop digitizing software. That being said, the tools that I'll be using during these tutorials are tools that should be common to most digitizing programs. I hope that you find this tutorial helpful, and if you have any questions, please leave your comments at the bottom and I will address them as best as I can. Alright, let's get to it. Okay, so we're going to start off by selecting white as our color, and then we're going to select our input method, and in this case it's going to be complex fill. Then we're going to make sure that the overlapping rows of our complex fills will be set at 2. We're going to change the stitch type to a tatami or fill stitch with a density of 0.4 millimeters, a stitch length of 4.0 millimeters, and a minimum stitch length of 0.7 millimeters. I like 0.7 millimeters as my minimum stitch length because it cuts down on a lot of thread breaks. We're also going to turn off our underlay for all fill stitches because we're going to be using what I like to call a universal underlay. And the reason I use a universal underlay is whenever I have a bunch of fill stitches in a design, I use this universal underlay as a way to hold everything together so that everything lines up at the end of the design. So we're digitizing our outline here, and you might notice that I'm going very close to the edge on the left hand side of the object and on the right hand side of the object, and that's because there's going to be pull on the left hand side and the right hand side because my stitches are running from left to right. What do I mean by pull is basically that when you embroider a column, it's going to pull in on itself, collapsing the width, making it thinner. But when you do that, or when that happens, all the material gets pushed out to the top and the bottom, making it longer. So in effect, you'll have the originally digitized column on the left and the actual final embroidery on the right, and you can see how it's thinner and taller. Okay, so now we're going to select our running stitch tool, and we're going to set our running stitch length to 1.8. The reason I like 1.8 is because by you putting in a nice tight stitch length, it'll follow the curves a lot better. So we're going to travel from this complex fill that we just did to the next one that we're going to do. We try to travel from object to object as much as possible because we want to cut down on the number of trims. Trims make your design messy, and they slow down the machine because the machine's got to slow down to do the cut, so it ends up making your design longer to embroider. So we're going ahead and digitize our second object, go back to our travel tool, or running stitch tool that is, go to the next object and digitize our complex fill again. Again, notice how close I'm getting to the edges on the left hand side and the right hand side, and not so much on the bottom, because I know that when I embroider this, the bottom and the top are going to push up and down, and the sides are going to push inwards on themselves. So then when you go to do your capping stitch, if you don't account for that, it won't line up properly. Okay, so now we're going to switch to our red. And for here, what we're going to do is we're going to switch our underlay to a edge walk. And the reason we're putting an edge walk underlay is because we don't want the red and the white bleeding into each other. We want a nice crisp edge. And what that edge walk underlay does is it creates a sort of bridge, if you will, between the two so they won't sink into each other. So that way you get a nice crisp edge. You can also achieve the same result by giving the edges of your fills where they meet two different angles, so that way they don't sink into each other. But I want them to run in the same angle here, so that's why I put that edge walk underlay. Okay, so we did our first red fill. Now we're going to travel to the next one using our running stitch. Click on our complex fill to do our complex fill object again. Now, one thing that you need to keep in mind also is when you're digitizing and you're accounting for the push and the pull, you need to realize that the stretchier the material is, the more pull and push you're going to have, and materials that don't stretch so much, you'll have to compensate less for. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to select our Input C tool or our Centerline Input. Basically what this tool is you digitize a line, and then the software puts in a nice even column at the specific width that you give it. And in this case we're going to use a 1.5 millimeter width column. And for that width of a column, a 0.35 millimeter density should be good. The wider the column, the tighter you want the densities. The thinner the column, you want to put less stitches, so less density. Again, because there's going to be a capping stitch, we're not going to want our stitches to sink into our fill, so that's why we put a edge walk underlay for this column as well. Again, that edge walk underlay will act as a bridge so it doesn't sink into the fills, and it comes out nice and crisp. Okay, so now we're going to do the top part. Go back to our fill stitch. All my settings are good. 0.4, 0.7 millimeter density. Complex fill. Again, following close to the left edge and the right edge. And we're going to run to our next complex fill so that we don't do unnecessary trims. Trims are bad when you're digitizing. You want to kill as many trims as possible. Sometimes it just can't be helped. It's the nature of the logo that you're digitizing, and just you have to trim. So, but when you can avoid it, it's best to avoid it. Travel again. And our next complex fill. Now you always want a little bit of overlap between two fills. And you can see that I'm going inside the red fill with the white. And the last white complex fill. Oops, fix that. Again, you notice how I didn't go so close to the bottom part, and I'm very close to the edge on the left and the right hand side. Okay, switch over to our red. Zoom in so we can see what we're doing a little bit better. Complex fill. Make my fill. Entry, exit point, and my angle. Running stitch to travel to the next one. And complex fill again. Again, entry point, exit point, and my angle. Whoa, what was that? Exit and angle. There you go. Go back to our running stitch and travel to the next section. Now when I'm finished doing the red fill, I'm going to be digitizing the capping stitch using a different method. It's the longer method. I prefer using it. I prefer doing the capping stitch like I did on the first part, but some softwares don't have that single line input tool, so I'm going to do it also the long way. Basically what the long way is you're digitizing the whole column width and everything, not just a line and then have the software automatically put in the width. You gotta actually follow the width and digitize the whole shebang. It's more work, not as uniform, because there's always a little bit of human error. But I thought it was important that I show you both ways. Complex fill. Okay, entry point there, and exit with my angle. Why does it keep doing that? There you go. Alright. It's not very clean here, so we're going to clean things up here. Bring down my exit point. That's what that X is. Clean up some of the edges here. Alrighty. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to digitize the capping stitch using the longer method. We're going to travel to the beginning of the capping stitch. Alright. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to select our Input A tool, which is the input method for our capping stitch. Density should be 0.35, like the bottom one. And we digitize the edges of the column. So essentially we're digitizing the width of the column. Oh, I also noticed that I didn't tick off my auto spacing in my density. I should have that ticked off, and the spacing should be 0.35. So just keep that in mind. As you can see, the width of the columns aren't 100% perfect because you're doing everything manually here instead of having the computer follow the one line that you digitize and then laying an equal width column throughout that whole line. But like I said, not all softwares have that Centerline Input. And there you go. Clean this up a little bit here. The other thing I forgot to do is set the underlay to the edge walk underlay for the column. Okay, so now we're going to digitize the bow. Again, we're using our complex fill tool. Staying close to the edges, and then the bottom and the top you go more towards the middle, keeping in mind the push and the pull. Okay, entry point, exit point, and my angle. There you go. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to digitize our capping stitch for the bow, and we're going to go back to our Centerline Input because it's just a neater tool to use and faster. Lazy sometimes. Set our width to 1.5. Again, notice that we have selected center so that it's even on both sides of the line. We're going to change our underlay for the capping stitch to edge walk or edge run so that it doesn't bleed into our fill stitch. And satin stitch, let's take off these auto spacing. I don't like using the auto spacing. Okay, so let's start digitizing. Why did that change back? Okay, let me change this back to 1.5 millimeters and leave it on center. Just let me check the underlay, make sure it hasn't. That's bizarre. Okay, let's change this to 1.7 stitch length for the auto underlay. Satin stitch, take off the auto spacing. Okay, let's try this again. Let's zoom in so we could see better what we're going to be digitizing. And there we go, start digitizing the center of the line or the column. There you go, nice even columns. It's just so much easier to use the Centerline Input than digitizing it manually like we did the top part of the gain. Okay. Alright. So now we're going to digitize the rest of the bow. We're going to travel. Set our stitch length for our run stitch to 1.7. And we'll select our complex fill. The dummy, check our zoom in some more and go ahead and digitize the complex fill. Again, we didn't put any underlay on the complex fills yet because we're going to be adding on that universal underlay that I spoke of at the beginning of the tutorial. And that universal underlay will be the underlay for all the fills. It'll hold everything together a lot nicer than if you did a underlay for each object. Not each object, but each fill. Sorry. Okay. Again, keeping in mind to stay close to the edge on the left and right, and not so much on the top and the bottom. Entry point. Oh, well. Entry point, exit point, and my angle. Now I'm changing up my angle a little bit so that it gives a little more definition when it embroiders. And travel to our next section. For this part, I'm going to be digitizing with satin stitch instead of the usual fill stitch that we've been doing. And I'm not using the complex fill tool, I'm just using the input A tool. Notice that the angle that I'm digitizing it at, just so that it when I put in my capping stitch, I tried to avoid the capping stitch being 100% perpendicular to another satin stitch, because what ends up happening is when it's 100% perpendicular, the stitches tend to be pulled apart when you come over with the capping stitch. But by you putting it on a bit of an angle, it keeps it from splitting the stitches open. Going back to our input C tool or Centerline Input to get our nice even columns. Run to the next part. Now you notice that when I'm running from one part to the other, I try to stay inside sections that are not embroidered yet, but will be embroidered later on, so that it covers it up nicely. And it also doubles as an underlay. And travel again. Okay. And the last part of the bow. And voila. And you see the effect that by me putting in that sand stitch on the very center of the bow, it gives it a different look. Gives it a little bit more of gives it more definition. Looks nicer. Okay. So what we're going to do now is we're going to digitize the universal underlay. So I've backed up to the beginning of the design. I've selected my complex fill, and we're going to set our density for a fill stitch of 1.0. That's going to be our underlay. So we don't need any underlay underneath our underlay. Okay, and we're going to start digitizing. zoom in so that we can see better what we're doing. And we're digitizing our complex fill for our universal underlay. Now you can't get too close to the edges on the side because you don't want that underlay to poke through. You want it to stay within your design. And as you can see, we're encompassing the whole logo. And that underlay that we're going to digitize, it's going to serve as an underlay for all the objects. And what that does is just it's going to keep everything nice and tight from the very beginning of the logo, so that things tend to line up a lot nicer than if you put an underlay for each single complex fill. So I'll put my angle, and there it is. Gonna clean up some of these edges here. Like I said, I don't want them poking through by it being too close to the edge, but at the same time I want to make sure I encompass the whole logo. Okay, I think that's okay. So there you have it. You can now save the design and embroider it on your machines. If this tutorial was helpful, I would love it if you could give us a thumbs up at the bottom of this screen. Or if you wish to be notified of future videos, please subscribe to our channel, or simply go to our website and subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll hopefully see you soon.